This week's video teaching is for you if you've ever suffered from trauma, either as an adult or a child, if you've been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. We're going to be talking about those two things, how the inner child is affected, and most importantly, how you can heal and recover from any traumas, whether you've experienced them in your childhood or adulthood, by working with the inner child and our Wu Wei Wisdom techniques. So please hang on till the end of the video, or the second half of the video, when we'll be offering some practical tips and solutions for you. If you're new to our YouTube channel,
welcome along,
and want to learn more about Wu Wei Wisdom and how it can help you connect to the real and authentic you, flow effortlessly through life, and live vibrantly with 100% passion and purpose, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the bell notifications button to receive all our latest videos. What I'd like to start with, David, so we're absolutely clear on this, is how would you define trauma, PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, and the inner child, just so that we're clear up front about those definitions?
See, I'd love to do those definitions because they're very important. And the first one I'd like to start with is one you haven't mentioned, and I'd like to say that everyone who is experiencing this, has had this diagnosis, is unique. Mm-hmm. So some of the things we say today will not apply to you, some will apply to you. Do not think one is worse or better than anyone else. So hang on in with me and let me give you the broad brush, and then we can try and define it more onto you. So first of all, if you think of the acronym P, post, that means it's happened to you. It was in the past. So it's not something that's happening to you right now. It's not a trauma you're experiencing right in this moment of your life. It's past. Trauma. So my definition of trauma from a Taoist perception is something that goes out of your normal everyday expectations, what you consider to be fair or just, what you consider to be a normal life, what your considerations, and this is why it's different for everyone, because everyone, if you lived, I don't know, in China, your considerations, what would be normal, would be different to somebody who lived in America. Mm-hmm. So a trauma is something that takes you out of your, if you want, comfort zone, something that happened you wasn't expecting.
I mean, you're talking like a massive jolt out of your comfort zone.
No, it doesn't have to be a massive jolt. This is where I said at the beginning, some people will define a trauma that they've just witnessed a terrible rail accident and seen people die, and they go, oh my God, that's a terrible trauma, because it's out of their comfort zone. They've never seen this before. Someone could identify a trauma of getting knocked down in the road. They could identify a trauma of their family suddenly getting divorced, and they didn't realize. A trauma for someone could be your partner just found out they've been having an affair for 5 years and you didn't even know about it. So it's that jolt, it's that sudden thing that takes you out of your normal expectations, your framework.
So I guess your framework is going to be completely different as a child compared to an adult.
And that's why we defined in our description this idea of inner child. And I'll explain that in a minute. So trauma, be clear on what your trauma. And again, can I repeat, one trauma isn't better or worse than someone else's trauma. Yeah. It is unique to you. Yeah. It's on your journey. Yeah. I would look at it as a spiritual lesson that you have to understand and embrace. So post, anti, part gone in the past, trauma, out of your normal realms of what you think is normal, stress. Well, we're back to our normal thing we talk about every week. Stress is a red light. Who creates a red light? You are creating the red light.
As a response to the trauma.
As a response to the trauma. Okay. So you are creating the red light because it's something that you haven't mentally been able to quantify or to balance or to understand. Process is another great word, Alex. Yeah. So that creates the red light. Remember, the red light is telling you there's a thought or a belief you need to look at and change.
Okay.
And so that's what I call PTSD. Why we like to tag on the end inner child. If you look back at some of our videos, I really love the term inner child because it relates to a part of your mind. Remember, it's not separate. It's not floating around. It's not a different entity. It's your mind. And what can happen with our minds is our minds, when it meets these incidences that are out of our expectation, it can kind of lock up. It can freeze. It can hold on. Now, if this happens as a child, and we've said before, my experience of doing this for 30, 40 years now, normally between the ages of 6 and 10 is a very relevant age, the part of your mind can kind of freeze.
So you have, as a child, you have the expectation, you then encounter the experience, so that could be a one-off experience, or it could be a repeated series of experiences.
Yes. Yes.
And then your inner child reacts, or your mind reacts.
She can't. The child. She hasn't got the knowledge, the expertise, the education to deal with that, so that they then freeze it. You know, and you hear these terms. In Great Britain, we've got terms like sweep it under the rug, you know, put it in a box, compartmentalize it, forget about it, move on. You see, a lot of men will do this, you know, tough up, stick your chest out, move on, don't let it affect you. But the problem is, it's still there. You haven't addressed or dealt with the trauma. Whatever the trauma is, the incident is for you. You've never dealt with it. And what you actually do, as we'll talk about later, you put it on a kind of a carousel, and it comes around later and kind of carries on coming around. And so that term that we use, the inner child, is to describe this part of your mind. Everybody's got it. Everyone's got an inner child. We have incidences in our childhood that affect us, and it seems ridiculous. You know, a big person seeing something like that can really affect us, can make us cry when we see it on television or in a film. And it's because we haven't resolved that issue inside of us.
Okay, so
is that clear?
I've got another question related to that. I understand what you're saying is if something happens to us which is traumatic as a child, that part of our mind, which we call the inner child, goes into lockdown and doesn't mature and develop. It holds on, it doesn't process, it doesn't want to process, it freezes.
And it wants to protect.
Now, what happens if an adult has a trauma, does the same part of their mind, that inner child part of their mind, get affected in the same way?
It does, you know, and this is what I've found when I've worked with a lot of clients. I've worked with soldiers and emergency services who see horrendous things when they explain it to me. It's like you couldn't understand how people could see this and carry on living. But it's touching that part of your mind, that inner child, and its difficulty in dealing with something that's out of its realms, out of its bounds.
It's out of its understanding and its control.
And it doesn't want to understand it because they will use terms like scared, fearful. But really, those are red lights. What it's saying is, I don't want that to happen to me. I don't want to address that. I can't process that. It's almost like I've just swallowed something. You know, when sometimes you swallow something and it gets stuck in your throat and you can't bring it one way or the other way. And it's almost like that. And this is what happens. It gets stuck there. And then your mind does this wonderful thing because the mind is programmed to protect you, to keep you safe. And so it starts to build up a wall around it. It starts to push people away. It gives you justifications why you can't do this, you can't go out, you can't go on a train again, you can't go on a plane again, you know, you can't do this, you can't travel. It will always give you these reasons.
Yeah, I mean, there's loads. We'll talk about, I guess, the manifestations of what happens when your mind does go into that lockdown because of the trauma. But very briefly, I think it's an important point that you make at the beginning. There's such a variety of ways in which someone could, unfortunately, experienced trauma. I know when we were talking before, you've worked with clients who obviously have suffered things like childhood abuse, physical, emotional, sexual, suffered a trauma because of some form of abandonment, whether that's, a loss of a parent, death of a parent or a guardian at an early age, or through the process of adoption. So as a child, there's many ways in which you could experience that trauma. As an adult, equally, and I think this is more commonly spoken about in the press, we talk about PTSD with war veterans, but equally, as you mentioned, the emergency services, people can experience traumas. I know from having serious accidents or witnessing serious
and getting
incidents,
over operations, sudden operations, you're suddenly rushed in, and you can get over the physical operation, but you're left at the end, and then the mind goes into what if? What if that person hadn't phoned the ambulance? What if the ambulance had been late? What if I couldn't have got into the... And so that's what, you see, the mind does it. That mind begins to overwork and overprotect you.
So we know you've explained really well what happens to the mind during that incident, actually during the incident. So when someone then later on, whether it's, I guess it could be immediately after the incident or a few months later or a few years later, what's typical, David?
It can be years later that I notice when I deal with veterans. It's when they're in the army, it seems as though they're trained up, or the services, let's not just say the army, as when they're in the services, they're trained up, and it's like the atmosphere that they're in, this is kind of acceptable. But when they come back and live in normal life, then it's almost suddenly, it starts to play back into their memory. And remember what I said at the beginning? The mind hasn't processed it. So it's like that little bit of food's got stuck in your throat. And then when you come back into Civvy Street and normal life, then it's on the roundabout. And the mind, exactly, it's on the loop. That's another
And is this the same thing as a carousel that you talk about? It's
exactly the same thing as a carousel. It's what's the mind. The mind can't swallow it. The mind can't spit it out. And so it's kind of stuck in limbo, and it goes around and around and around. And again, I repeat, I'm sorry to repeat myself, but this can be a big incident, or it can be what you consider to be the many times that people have sat down in front of me and said, oh, I'm sure you hear a lot of things. This isn't so serious. Don't think that. If it's important for you, it's important for me. It's important for you. What it's telling you, you're being offered a lesson there. And it's very important that we sit with it and we find a solution that you can digest it, that you can move on through it. If you think a cure for trauma is to put it on the back burner, forget about it, never talk about it again, sweep it under the carpet, whatever term you want to use, this will not work. Listen to this won't work. It never has worked.
I guess I kind of imagine it from what you said, David, that if it's put in the box or put on loop, on repeat, and as much as you'd like to avoid dealing with it or avoid experiencing the emotions again associated with it, it's almost like the mind and body, the energy starts to seep out in other ways. The energy of the experience, as much as you want to keep a lid on it, energy can't be held. That's the Taoist teaching. Energy can't be held. It starts to come out. And as you say, you start to get recollections. Now, I know there's the main thing with PTSD is re-experiencing things like flashbacks or having nightmares. Then in terms of emotions and red light feelings, what would they be as well? Anxiety.
So flashback is the main one. You can see something on television or read something or hear something in the news. I'm just remembering a client who couldn't listen to the news because just listening to the news would bring back some incidences that he had in his service. So it can be flashbacks, but it would definitely, most definitely, there's no query here, affect you on deeper levels. It affects your sleep. It will affect your eating. It will affect your relationships with yourself and with other people. You might go to drinking more, smoking more, gambling more, spending out, not being able, because you see, you're holding on to this emotion, and it's almost like instead of your mind focusing on you living your life to your fullest extent, to being the best that you can be and enjoying your life, your mind is diverted into protecting you, keeping you safe, avoiding. So
these are all strategies that the inner child and the mind creates to avoid facing up to what happened.
You're in a sense of arousal. You would say that you're always ready, and one of the terms
on edge,
fight or flight.
Yeah.
It's almost like you're going to run away or punch somebody's lights out. You know, I sometimes have a laugh with a client who said, if somebody disagrees with me, I feel like grabbing the hair and swinging them around in the air. And it's almost like you've got this energy built up inside of you. And instead of learning how to let it go in a very natural and authentic and correct way, you're suppressing it. And so that goes against, you're creating a tension inside of you, which then has to go out. What you said is the Taoist teaching, the most important thing. Here's a spiritual lesson. You can't stop energy. You can't hold it. You can't store it. You can't put it on the side for later. It's always flowing. Remember, how many times in these teachings do we talk about a river? You can dam up a river, but it will find a way through.
And the pressure builds up.
And the pressure builds up.
And manifests in all the things we've talked about. Despite, I guess, your best efforts to avoid, whether it's avoiding a practical situation in your day-to-day life, in relationships, in your career, in how you socialize with people, or whether it's avoiding the emotions, as you said, through drinking, drugs, maxing out on your credit card. Despite all those strategies the inner child does, or the mind does, to try and protect you, to stop you from experiencing it again, because it's very fearful you're going to experience it again, the energy still comes out.
That's right.
It still comes out.
This is why.
But in the wrong way.
Exactly, Alex. It's so important because the point you made earlier, it's so important. This is why the inner child needs help. Doesn't need to be punished more. Doesn't need to be told it's stupid. It doesn't need to be told that what it's worried about isn't important. Doesn't need any of that. It needs loving guidance. And we've talked about emotional things, but don't forget physical things. Stress, what you would call, I would call red lights, can come out in things like skin disorders, eczema, digestive disorders,
headaches,
all types
muscular
of things,
tension,
all
bad
types
backs,
of things. This is why this is so important. Do not underestimate it. Do not think that yours isn't important to some soldier that saw a trauma in a battlefield. It's a trauma to you. It's a trauma. That's okay. It's your trauma. And the question now is, how are you going to deal with it? And don't make it post. Deal with it now, in the moment. You have everything you need right now to deal with it. Remember, you are awesome. You got through that trauma, whether it was a trauma in your childhood, breakup in the family, abuse in some form. You have got through it. The word here is post, anti. It's behind you. You're the one that's bringing it in front of you. Don't put things in the past in front of you because you're reliving it.
I would imagine a lot of people who have suffered from trauma and who have been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder believe that in some way they have been damaged by the incident, and that they're kind of scarred. It's beyond repair, and that's absolutely not what you're saying.
Absolutely can be the absolute opposite. What Alex has just said, I hear all the time. I'm damaged. I'm soiled. It can never be repaired. I'm always looking for something. I need something, someone else. I need other people's validation. I need other people's love. I'm always looking outside. I call it externally. I'm looking externally for this, what I need, what was taken away from me, what wasn't given to me, what was given to me wrongly, where I was told one thing, I'm doing this because I love you, and actually it was for something else. I was tricked, I was deceived. I am now there for the victim. I'm sorry. I know you're an individual, but I do not see you as a victim. I see you as a beautiful, divine human being who got through that. And you have to believe in yourself. You can't look externally. Everything you need, everything you want is internal.
And if someone comes to you and says, okay, David, I understand what you're saying, that the incident didn't physically permanently damage me. However, that incident has affected my life up to this point in time now as an adult, whether it's, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years, 40 years ago. At that point, it is still possible to completely self-correct.
And this is where they don't...
Is that right or not?
And this is where they don't like me, because I would disagree with that statement. The only thing that's been affected is your belief system. And the only person that can change your belief system is you.
So when you say belief system, what do you mean?
It's your perception on life.
Perception of
exactly.
you and the outside world.
How
things should be.
How things should be.
So the world's against me. The world's a dangerous place. Men are bad,
anybody.
women are bad.
You can't trust anybody.
Or I'm a bad person.
Yeah.
Again, that turning it in, the incident in on themselves. Would that be important for a lot of clients?
All of these are important. Here comes another one. I want to be in control. I'm a control freak. I won't do anything unless I know the outcome. The problem is you never know the outcome. Therefore, I won't do anything. And it's always looking for these excuses, because it's your belief, which then affects your perception, which then means your world reduces. You are now punishing yourself. And this is, you're building a prison. This is how I see it. And this is a translation. Remember, a lot of these are my translations, but they're from teachings, from Taoist teachings, from maybe even 3,000 years ago. That you are building a prison, and you're then locking yourself in the prison because you think it's safer. Because something terrible happened to you, and I admit something terrible happened to you. It shouldn't have happened. It was unfair. It was unjust. I hope it never happens again. But you can't protect yourself for life in case it does happen again, because then you're restricting your life. And everything that Alex says there, it was exactly right. There's so many, this is what I said at the beginning. You can be listening to this and say, oh yeah, they haven't talked about what I think though. All of those things, think about it as an umbrella. If you think that something is unfair, it shouldn't be that way. I've got to make sure I need to be in control. I can't go out.
I don't want that to happen to me again.
I don't want that to happen to me again. So I'm going to avoid that situation. I can't go out if it may snow in case I get stuck in the snow. I can't do this. I can't go there. I can't do that. Then what happens?
You're shrinking down. You're shrinking your life down, your life potential, your life possibilities.
All of the time.
Yeah.
And you cannot be protected. Much better to learn, and here's the Wu Wei, much better to learn how to be adaptable, flexible, use your immense ability. Remember, any trauma, you got through it. It didn't beat you.
Okay.
You got through it by the skin of your teeth, maybe, but you got through it. Learn that lesson. Learn what you need to learn about that lesson.
As hard as it was.
As hard as it was.
Okay.
As difficult as it was for you. But understand that you have everything that you need. And do not look externally for someone else to put it right, or to control other people, to manipulate them so they say what you want them to say.
And you can avoid the re-experiencing and the emotions and everything that came with that first incident or that first series of incidents.
Yeah, so rather than trying to avoid the incident, learn how to deal with the incident. That's the key. Don't try and avoid it because you can't. Learn. Because you're right. Unfortunately, something similar may happen again. I hope it doesn't, but something similar may happen again. But if you're aware, if you're switched on, you're much better prepared to spot it, and you won't go through that in the same way. You'll bring your experience, your expertise, your knowledge, your education. You are a different person than you were. That was an incident in your history behind you, not in front of you. You are the one that's putting it in front of you.
Okay, so you've got the incident in a box or on loop. Someone comes to you as a therapist, comes for some Wu Wei Wisdom support and your techniques, David. How does that individual who's suffering, either for themselves or with you, begin to work with the inner child and deal with that past trauma? Are there any practical steps that you use or that you can recommend for people?
Yeah, and it's one that we talk about quite regularly on the Wu Wei Wisdom. And it's, again, a translation from a Taoist teaching. Sit with it. So what I would do is, it's the golden thread. So
sit with what?
Well, this I'm just going to explain.
Okay.
So they'll come with perhaps anxiety or stress or a drinking problem, a sleeping problem, whatever.
So that's at the top of the pyramid.
Yeah,
that's
right.
The surface level problem that they have recognised that they're suffering with. Yeah.
Then you do the golden thread, and then you're trying to find the root cause. Mm-hmm. Now, if the root cause is a trauma, which it normally always is, a past in the trauma, you come back, you have to find the trauma, and then you sit with it. So it's almost like you're reliving the trauma, but in a more controlled way. You're sitting with your client this time, because remember, when they originally experienced the trauma, they had nobody with them, nobody to talk to, nobody to share what they were thinking and their beliefs. Now you go through them almost holding their hand, metaphorically, and you go through them at their speed. And this is why people often say to me, how long is this going to take? Yeah. And I often say, well, it'll take about a second, but the process could take a week, 2 weeks, a month. It's down to you. You set the agenda.
Okay, I want to work back through that again, so I'm completely understanding what you're saying. Typically, you would begin with the surface level complaint.
Yes.
As we said, whether it's a physical health complaint or an emotional health complaint or something like a sleep. Yes. You said you do the golden thread work to get to the cause. Now, for people who don't understand what you mean by golden thread work, and what do you actually mean by that, David?
So the two main fundamentals of the golden thread work, and again, we've got plenty of videos on this, so if you want to know more information, just go and have a look at those. The fundamentals are this. You control your mind. Your mind does not control you. So that's very important. And if you disagree, you know what to do. Write below, and I'll answer your comments. You control your mind doesn't control you.
So it's about putting you in the position of self-responsibility now to start doing this work.
Absolutely. Yeah. And number 2, you are the creator of all your emotions. You are not the victim. So this is very important. You are not a victim. That PTSD, stress, red light, you're creating the red light. Yeah. The trauma is not creating the red light.
Because of how your inner child and your mind, and how you're letting your mind, your inner child, continue to deal with it incorrectly,
inappropriately. The trauma may have happened 30 years ago, it may have happened last year, but it's not happening now. And this is the difference with this. It's not something that's happening currently, it's happened. So you are not the victim of your emotion. Sorry. You create your, I'll get this right. I should get it right. I say it enough times. You create your emotions. You're not the victim of them. So how you do this is to stop using the word I feel.
So I feel stressed.
Stop that.
I feel anxious when I think about the situation, the past trauma, or I feel anxious about the prospect of going into an enclosed environment because it's related to the past trauma.
And you replace I feel with one of these 3. I think, I choose, I believe. So instead of saying, I feel scared to go on a train, I choose not to go on this train. That would be a much better statement. Then I can say to you, so why did you choose not to go on this train? Why did you make that choice? And then you would say, well, 3 years ago I was on the train and and then we can deal with the actual. So it goes down to the actual problem.
So the golden thread from what you're saying, David, you're starting with the high level symptoms, whether it's the red light feelings or the physical manifestations of headaches, digestive problems.
Skin problems, digestive problems.
You then get rid of the F word, the feelings. You start looking at the beliefs, why you think, why you believe, or why you choose to avoid or do certain things which are causing the red light feelings. Yeah. You then continue to question why, till you get down to the core belief, which is, is that the belief that the inner child is holding tightly onto and is trying to protect?
There's the spiritual lesson that the inner child can't deal with. It's just stuck. You found, the Chinese call it the kernel. You found like the little root right down there. It's very difficult to find because over years you built all this protection around it. Yeah. All these strategies, lies, deceits, half-truths, quarter-truths. And my job is to try and get to the kernel. What is it?
The core belief.
The core, right down in the core. And that can be very challenging and very uncomfortable for you. Yeah, very uncomfortable.
That is then what you sit with. That's the second part you're describing.
Then you sitting with
it. So it's a process of almost like a fact-finding process. And then confronting.
That's right.
Confronting. So
not confrontation.
Yeah. So confronting, but in a compassionate way, would you say?
Yeah. Interested, willing to learn, wanting to know more information. That's what we would do when we finally got through, when we've gone through the process and the client's happy to sit in it or sit with it, whichever you prefer. The translation can be sit with it or sit in it. Yeah. It's sometimes better to sit in it. You sit right in the middle of it. And then you say, okay, so what's going on for you now? What is this going on for you? What do you think now your parents have just split up? What do you think now you failed the 11 plus? What do you think now you've just come through that abuse? What is it you thinking? What do you believe? And as you said much earlier, they've normally turned it onto themselves. Okay. It's me. Okay. There must be something wrong with me. So, there's nothing wrong with you.
And would you say that for things like childhood abuse, abandonment in childhood, or perceptions of abandonment, in terms of the trauma that's created because of that, the core belief that you find when you do the golden thread process is that it must be me, there's something wrong with me, that happened to me?
Again, you can't be precise for every single person of the thousands of people who are very happy that you support us and watch our videos. I can't be precise for each one, but that would be one of the common ones. Here comes another common one, that you believe that love or validation or attention is external, and you need that. You need that to survive. And this would be an analogy that I would use. It's like oxygen.
Yeah, okay.
You need that oxygen mask. The only problem is that you're not in control of the dial, and you have to please other people, do what they say, pacify them, keep them happy, so they turn the love onto you, and you can live. Because some people think if they turn the love off, if they leave you,
they're going to die. I guess that's...
A child would think that, you see. It's as serious as that.
That's the ultimate, really, isn't it? For the mind does not... It's about self-protection, self-preservation.
And so why wouldn't you set up spending your life trying to please people because you think you need their gratification. You need them to like you. Remember, a lot of the things that people just... One of the questions I get asked when I do talks is this quote I say, what other people think of me is none of my business. And they go, that's crazy. Of course, what people think of you is very important. and they're looking for their validation. So it's almost like this oxygen. You need this oxygen to keep living. And I'm here to tell you, you do not need that oxygen. You got everything you need in abundance. You are a spiritual person. And this is why I believe that these are spiritual teachings. You are a spiritual person. You are awesome, magnificent. Everything that's come your way so far in your life, you have dealt with it. You have coped. You will continue to cope. All we're talking about is the method of coping, how well you cope. And that's down to you. It's down to your perception. It's down to your tactics. It's how good, how clear. And if you restrict your life down like this, as though you're following a little path of light, you're going to have trouble when you've got all of the alternatives open to you.
And I think what you're saying, David, is your perception of you in relation to the event is almost like adds, if you misunderstand and misinterpret what happened, it adds another layer of bad symptoms, insofar as you believe you can't do anything about it. You think it's going to take forever to heal. You feel again like you're damaged in some way, and that's another. It becomes another avoidance, doesn't it? If you misunderstand what's happened and how you can now, the fact that you can take self-responsibility, as you said, that you are able to control your emotions if you choose to. I think almost signing up to that mission statement at the beginning of the process of healing from a trauma or recovering from PTSD is important. And I think, would you say that's why you almost have that as the beginning point of this process, this therapy work?
Well, I think you've said a lot there. I think this is one of the things. You see, all of what Alex has said there is really good, and I could have almost stopped her on every point, because one of the things the mind uses to protect itself is confusion. And it would love to it gets you, I call it the maze. It gets you lost in the maze. You build a maze, it puts itself in the middle of a maze and builds a maze around it, so everybody gets lost in the maze. The only problem is it gets lost in its own maze and it gets stuck itself. So yes, you can have this original problem, this kernel, this knob of the problem, and then by the avoidance, you can then start eating too much, and then you've got a weight problem, or you can start drinking too much, then you've got an alcohol problem.
Okay, so it creates almost like a distraction.
Exactly.
A distraction problem, but now, you're not dealing with the original.
Exactly, and sometimes the mind will prefer you having something like a weight problem, because that's almost like a little bit acceptable. Other people have got weight problems, or other people have got drinking problems. But at the same time, the mind is protecting the kernel, the real problem. And unfortunately, this is why that although, you can solve a problem, that's why when people will say things like to me, well, I sorted my weight problem out and now I'm smoking too much, or I'm gambling too much. And what the mind is doing is setting these diversions, these illusions that get you trapped into other things. And that's why the golden thread to get through the maze is so important. And to get through the maze, stop using I feel. Own what I think. This is what I think. So it'll end up with one of the three lies. I know we haven't got time to do this. I'm not good enough. I can't cope. I'm unlovable. And all of those are lies.
I was going to say, we've talked about the core belief for a child, or a child who suffers a childhood trauma. The core belief for an adult who suffers a trauma is also potentially the same. Well, when you get down to it.
It'll be potentially the same, and this is why it's very unique. So if a soldier sees a traumatic incident on a battlefield, although the training has helped him to cope with that, and probably as they're in the army, they can cope with that because they're around their mates and everybody sees the same. But what normally happens is when they come out of that environment and they come back to their own environment, and then they start living a normal life, do you want to call it? Then all of a sudden, the mind starts to process what's happened and starts comparing. Well, look at that. How could you deal with that? And then when something goes wrong, perhaps they don't get a job, or perhaps their girlfriend leaves them, or they get divorced, and they go, oh, it must be that. It must be because I can't deal with that. And so what the mind will do is to use it as a kind of an excuse, as a justification, instead of focusing on the real issue. So if they're holding on to that memory, if the memory's on the carousel, our job is to go and take it off the carousel, to go and try and, as if we can, rationalize it, if you want of a better word. I much prefer to sit in it, talk through it, sit in the problem, don't run away, don't go and run and hide, as bad as it is, whether you scream and shout and cry.
Because I was going to say, surely people or clients say to you, but David, this is just going to be too painful. I really want to solve this problem. I don't want to have this issue or these uncomfortable red light feelings anymore. I know it's affecting my life badly. However, the prospect of facing up to the incident again, experiencing the emotions again, I don't know whether I'm going to be able to cope with it. It's all too much for me.
Thank you, Alex. There's the nub of the problem. Alex has just explained it succinctly. That's the nub of the problem. That's what the mind will tell you. I do not want to go there.
So that's the mind talking. Because it's the mind, the inner child, that doesn't...
Exactly. You've just explained it absolutely correctly. When you're listening to this, if this affects you, your mind has already probably said this to you. Oh, I couldn't go and sit with him and talk about it again. Oh, that would be the worst thing. That would be the last thing I'd want to do. It is the thing you have to do. You have to do it. Because if you don't do it, it just keeps on coming back in little chunks. And you're still doing it. It's not that you're going to stop doing it. You're just doing it in a different way. But the way of sitting in it is that you're going to clear it up once and for all. And then what I say to my clients is, bring it on. We're here. We're in the room together. I'm not going anywhere. You can shout and scream. I don't care. We will work through this step by step. One of the big things that I try and do, I call it baby steps, one step at a time until it's clear.
So it doesn't have to be done in like a massive, exhaustive session.
It can be if you want to.
It can be measured. It can be done in baby steps.
And because part of it is to put you back in control. So it can be done in any way that you want to be done. That's why when people say, how long is this going to take? I say to them, however long you want it to take. Once I'm committed, I will go right to the end. Now, this could be 1 session, 10 sessions, 10 years. This could be as long as you want to be, because what happens invariably is you go so far and they get a relief and then they don't want to do any more, and that's fine. We would never chase anybody up. I would never say, you've got to come back and finish. You're in control. Remember what I said. You control your mind. Your mind doesn't control you. So I respect you and I respect your journey. And this is your process. This happened to you. You have to find a way to resolve this issue in your mind. This is your journey. This is your spiritual lesson.
So you've explained how if someone was working with you face-to-face at our therapy centre or via Skype, how you would work with them. If they were doing this work for themselves, and up until now they had been avoiding, everything was on the loop or boxed off, when the mind and the inner child kind of says to them, you don't want to go there, this is going to be too painful, you don't want to, run that through your mind, you don't want to experience those emotions again, because that, I guess, will be the first thing that happens. What do they say? How do they talk to that part of their mind, their inner child?
Fantastic question. And this is why I love the term inner child. This is one of the reasons why I think this term really works. Because if this is you that Alex has just explained, then think about your mind as your little child, as you were 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. How would you liked your parents to have dealt with you? What would you have liked? What would you have wanted?
How would they support you?
What do you want? And you support your inner child. This is why if you use this term inner child, it really works well, because you can 10 minutes a day, you can sit down with your inner child. It's like a meditation, isn't it? It's like self-talk. And you sit down with your inner child. Here's a couple of tips. Do not criticize.
No, don't ignore, first of all, I suppose. Don't ignore.
Well,
don't ignore the inner child.
That's right. So you do not criticize him. You do not be judgmental. And you do not compare. CCJ, we call it. Do not criticize. Do not compare. Do not be judgmental. You listen to what they have to say, and you address what they have to say. And it's quite in order to say, if your mind gives you something, like I can tell you what it would normally say, it's not fair. If you can't answer it, it's okay to say, that's a good point. Let me have a think about that. Tomorrow's meditation, I'll come back and give you an answer. And so the mind sees for the first time it's being recognized. It's not being pushed away. It's not saying it's stupid. It's not saying it's meaningless. It's giving it meaning. It's giving you meaning. And you're starting to bring that part of your mind that's frozen together as a team. And remember, as a team, you are unstoppable. No one can stop you, because you're living your life authentically, truthfully, and you're on a mission. You're on a mission and you're in the flow. So you can definitely do this by yourself. And for some people, it's the best way to do it. I've given you some tips. Don't let the mind say, oh, I feel like I'm worthless. No, if it says, I think I'm worthless, then you can ask it, why do you think you're worthless?
So this is like doing the golden thread work for yourself.
Exactly.
So if the inner child and that part of your mind starts to say to you, I'm not going there, I don't want to relive that, I'm going to avoid that at all costs, don't criticize it.
No.
Don't be judgmental or dismissive.
No.
Acknowledge and validate that, yes, that happened, whether it's in your childhood or as an adult, and then talk it through with it. Give it reassurance.
And so one thing about the inner child, it can't storm out the room and leave you. So you say, okay, so you might not be ready to do it yet, but for 10 minutes a day, I'm going to sit down quietly and think about that.
And you can build
and
on.
You can join in if you want to. Wouldn't that be a nice thing to do? You don't have to join in. I'm quite happy to sit quietly for 10 minutes. I'm quite happy to drop my shoulders and think about that incident, that traumatic incident that happened to us last year in our childhood when this happened. You don't have to join in if you don't want to. And even doing that will give the child, that part of your mind, a different way of looking at it. You won't deal with it the way you've been dealing with it. Like Einstein says, you can't solve old problems with old thinking. You've got to find a new way of doing it, sitting with it. Actually, once you get over that first initial rush of emotions, which won't kill you, they're only emotions, it can be one of the most exhilarating, uplifting, exciting time in your life, because you're dealing with life issues. You're learning emotional education that's going to change your life forever in all forms of your life, in your career, in your education, in your relationships. Every part of your life, you'll become more authentic.
And as you begin to do that process, either with a therapist or by yourself, you say build up gradually, 10 minutes a day, half an hour a day, sitting quietly at home, when you're going out for a walk.
10-15 minutes is fine,
That then begins to release the held energy in a natural way. So it's not oozing out because it's under such pressure. It starts to naturally release and things self-correct.
So again, for those of you who do cooking, remember a pressure cooker? What you're doing is just knocking the top of the pressure cooker, and you're just easing off the pressure, and you're dealing with the issues one at a time. And there'll be really difficult issues, really complicated issues. And I don't expect you to come up with an answer just straight away. you may have to work through it. You may be on one issue for a week, 2 weeks, just working through the issue. But that process in itself is very strong for the child, because the child is being listened to. The child is getting the guidance. The child's hand is being held. You're working together. You're bringing yourselves together at one. This is one of the most powerful things that you can do. And remember, we're talking about spirituality, the spirit of who you are, the essence of who you are, that I call Shen, your Shen nature, honoring that you really are. You are more than just skin and bones and a collection of cells. You are more than that. You are that, of course. You are this physical human body with emotions, but there's something else about you that makes you awesome. Do not deny that part of you. And this is what the Wu Wei Wisdom is about. It's about honoring that part of you. You are immense, awesome. You can deal with anything that comes your way. And the evidence I have is you've already dealt with everything that's come your way. And so we can deal with it better moving on.
Brilliant. Thank you, David.
Thanks.
Well, I hope that's given you a really good overview.
From a difficult subject.
On a difficult subject, and giving you some insights in terms of how the inner child is affected and how you can begin to heal and recover from trauma and PTSD using the inner child work and some of our Wu Wei Wisdom techniques, such as the golden thread work. If you have any comments or questions, as always, please post them below and we'll be very happy to answer your questions. And we look forward to seeing you very soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.